The basic premise behind the study of learning is that people adjust their behavior in predictable ways to take advantage of the predictability of their experiences. Of course, you might have expected learning's basic premise to be something about knowing more, but it's not, traditionally at least, and for a couple of good reasons. One reason that people who study learning don't usually define it in terms of knowledge is that people, let alone rats and dogs and flatworms and sheep, don't always know what it is they've learned. They can do things that they had to have learned to do, but still not be able to spell out exactly what it is they learned. A second reason is that even when you do know what you've learned, what you know can only be seen by somebody else through your behavior, by what you do. When you've learned, you can hit a tennis ball in ways you couldn't before, regardless of what you may or may not know about how you do it. When you've learned, you get scores on tests that you couldn't have gotten before, solve problems you couldn't have solved before, and so on. So rather than focusing on knowledge, people who study learning focus on changes in behavior. And those changes in behavior might or might not have something to do with knowledge. Learning about learning is going to be easier for you than if you focus strictly on what's happening with stimuli and behaviors, and don't think about it in terms of what you or a rat might know. Hey, speaking of rats, if showing that somebody has new knowledge isn't necessary for showing that learning has happened, if all we need to do is demonstrate that behavior has changed in some way that's related to a pattern of experiences, then does it really even matter what kind of organism we're looking at? According to a lot of learning theorists, the answer is no, not usually. If learning is about changes in behavior, we might as well study rats and dogs and pigeons and sheep and flatworms and so forth, because they behave, and it can be a whole lot easier to study the things these sorts of creatures do than it is to study what humans do. Talking about learning in terms of animals and how they change their behavior can sometimes be a little off-putting, and sometimes might make the field of learning seem irrelevant to your behavior. But animal research does have its advantages. For one thing, you get a lot of control over the participants in your studies. When people study rats, for example, they often get them from their own labs where they've raised them in the same conditions, in the same cages, with the same kind of food. So in experiments with rats, one rat could be virtually interchangeable with another. With people, you don't know where they've been. The key reason for doing experiments is to find out whether a control group behaves differently from an experimental group only because of some experience one group had, thanks to the experimenter, that the other one didn't. So getting rid of differences in other experiences among the participants, which can be so easy to do with animals, is crucial to doing research the right way. For another thing, what learning theorists are interested in, being theorists, is general principles that describe how learning happens. If what you're interested in is general principles, it might not really matter whether you study rats or pigeons or dogs or people. In fact, it's probably better to study all kinds of organisms, because then you can show that these principles really are general principles, that they work across the board for all sorts of organisms, or that they don't. Also, research with animals is likely to be cheaper and faster to do than it would be with people. You don't have to pay animals. They don't have other appointments on their calendars. You can usually manipulate their environments more easily than you could a person's. It's easier to follow ethics guidelines for animal research than human research, and probably other things. Anyway, learning theories and learning research might revolve around what's been going on with animals, but the findings are meant to apply to humans as well, and usually they do. Keeping that in mind, and resisting the urge to think of learning in terms of knowing more, will make it a whole lot easier to understand why the study of learning works the way it does. By the way, cognitive theories of learning that deal with the influences of attention and memory and expectations and forming concepts have been getting more common over the last few decades, as have neural network models that are based on the actual structure of the brain. Even so, a lot of those explanations can be couched in terms of associations among stimuli and behaviors, as well as the phenomena they're meant to explain. So we'll stick with this traditional stimulus and response way of looking at learning and just occasionally take a look at how cognition might change the way you think about learning. What's problematic about thinking about learning in terms of knowledge? Why do so many learning researchers rely on using animals in their studies? People don't always know what they know, and forget about pigeons. And even if they did, the only way for an observer to tell what they know would be to see it show up in their behavior. So the study of learning is, at least traditionally, focused on changes in behaviors and how they come from patterns of experiences with stimuli. But that does have practical benefits in terms of being able to use animals in research in order to establish the general principles that become theories of learning. What's problematic about thinking about learning in terms of knowledge? First, people don't always know what they know. We often can't explain behaviors that we had to have learned. Second, if people who don't know what they know, or animals, are going to be studied, then we can't access their knowledge directly and have to rely on seeing manifestations of what might be knowledge in their behavior in order to know that learning has happened. Why do so many learning researchers rely on using animals in their studies? First, using animals can offer a lot of control over the participants' past experiences, as well as their experiences during the research. And that means that the only differences from participant to participant that could explain differences in their behavior would be the differences created by the researcher. Second, general principles that describe learning can be gleaned from animal research just as easily as from human research, and maybe even more appropriately, to the extent that different types of animals are studied. Third, using animals in research is often cheaper and easier than using people. Although lots of people question, not always unreasonably, the ethics of animal research, it's possible to use learning paradigms on animals that can't be used on humans. And that often means not having to set up elaborate studies to get around the ethical implications of studying humans. How might you sum up the substance of this video? What it says about learning in just a couple of sentences, like you would if you were talking to a 12-year-old. Thinking of learning in terms of the addition of knowledge can be problematic because knowledge can't always be measured directly. So learning researchers typically focus on changes in behaviors to tell them whether learning has happened and what it is that's been learned. it's usually easier to study changes in the behavior of animals, and that's one reason that learning research so often involves animals instead of humans.